Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. In the second half of tonight's show, I'm going to be joined by Helena No Justice MTG. In the first half, I have a really interesting interview with a former official in the State Department who resigned under Joe Biden. But we're going to be talking about current events in the Middle East. So the potential breakdown of the ceasefire deal, and in particular, those negotiations between Donald Trump and Jordan. In the second half of the show, we are going to talk about Labour and the Tories battling out in the Commons over who is going to be best placed to stop Gazan refugees coming to Britain. A little bit depressing. And Novara Media, on a lighter note, has made an appearance in that WhatsApp group from those Labour right-wingers that Aaron spoke about yesterday. We're going to end with a very bizarre scene from Elon Musk. And of course, actually, this just broke sort of before we went live, developments when it comes to Trump and his negotiations with Russia over the fate of Ukraine. Palestinians in Gaza are bracing themselves for the possibility that Israel's bombs will start falling once more this weekend. Now, that's after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made this statement last night.
If Hamas does not return our hostages by Saturday noon, the ceasefire will end, and the army will return to intense fighting until Hamas is finally defeated.
Hamas has said it will delay the release of further Israeli captives until Israel respects the terms of the ceasefire. They say Israel has continued to kill Palestinians in Gaza and refused to allow tents and other temporary homes into the Strip, a violation of the ceasefire's terms. The broader context, of course, is that the US president is calling for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and Israel is agreeing, right? And that has changed the incentive structures that were in place when the ceasefire deal was first signed. Now, in a bid to get the ceasefire back on track, a Hamas delegation has travelled to Cairo for talks with mediators there. Another militant group thought to be holding Israeli captives is Palestinian Islamic Jihad. In a Telegram message, a spokesperson for the group said this: "The fate of the prisoners held by the resistance is directly tied to Netanyahu's actions, for better or worse. The only viable solution for recovering prisoners or hostages and restoring stability is through a prisoner exchange deal. We hold the occupation government fully responsible for the consequences of its refusal to meet its obligations towards our afflicted people and its continued violations of the ceasefire agreement." It's in this context of a fraying ceasefire and a growing risk of further hostilities that King Abdullah of Jordan met with US President Donald Trump at the White House yesterday. It was always going to be a tricky meeting, with Trump having repeatedly vowed that Jordan would be the new home of at least some of the 1.8 million Palestinians the president has said should be ethnically cleansed from Gaza. That's a proposition that Jordan can't really accept, but Abdullah, who has ruled one of the most stable countries in a fairly unstable region for 25 years, is no stranger to tricky negotiations. He began by gently pushing back on Trump's Gaza plan while adding a sweetener.
One of the things that we can do right away is take 2,000 children that are either cancer children or in a very ill state to Jordan as quickly as possible, and then wait for, I think, the Egyptians to present their plan on how we can work with the president to work on the Gaza challenges.
So
I want to tell you, excuse me, wait, just please. I didn't know that what you just said, 2,000 children with cancer or other problems, and that's really a beautiful gesture. That's really good, and we appreciate it.
This must be so strange negotiating with Donald Trump, right? Because, obviously what Donald Trump is asking for, he wants, he spoke of sort of like 1 million people going to Jordan in a part of the country carved out, something that would be completely destabilizing for that country and for King Abdullah, right? And then you can bring out in that press conference that you're going to have 2,000 kids with cancer come to your country. A completely different proposition, right? Good. It's good that King Abdullah wants to allow 2,000 cancer patients into the country. Of course, it would be better if they could go to hospital in Gaza, but it was the Israelis that destroyed all of those. So given that's the reality, this is a good offer. But yeah, Trump seemed to take that really seriously, while King Abdullah was very much pushing back against his plan. Throughout that press conference, you heard King Abdullah keep repeating, "Let's wait for the plan from Egypt," right? I think he wants those Arab states to show a united front against what Trump is proposing, which is, of course, for far more than 2,000 people to move from Gaza to Jordan.
Palestinians will live somewhere else safe. Where exactly do you want them to live?
Well, it's not where I want them to live. It's going to be where we ultimately choose as a group. And I believe we'll have a parcel of land in Jordan. I believe we'll have a parcel of land in Egypt. We may have someplace else, but I think when we finish our talks, we'll have a place where they're going to live very happily and very safely. And, don't forget, they only want to be on the Gaza Strip because they don't know anything else. They've never had an alternative. And they don't want to be on the Gaza Strip, but they have no choice. They have to be. And they're being killed there at levels that nobody's ever seen. No place in the world is as dangerous as the Gaza Strip. They don't want to be there. They have no alternative. When they have an alternative, not one person will want to stay where they are. Nobody wants to stay there. They're living in hell.
Obviously, when it comes to sort of discourse about Gaza, right? You often hear, why are you so obsessed with Gaza? There are plenty of places in the world where people are getting killed. You now have a US president saying this is the most dangerous place to live in the world, right? Obviously, it was our bombs that did it, our unconditional support for their prime minister, the Israeli prime minister, that allowed for this to become the most dangerous place in the world. Oh, but now let's sort of flip the logic and say, because it's so bad, these people have to leave. In fact, they'll want to leave. There's, of course, no evidence that these people want to leave, right? See, there is a huge, it seems, sort of commitment to Palestinian land because they know what ethnic cleansing feels like. It's happened before. In that press briefing, Trump reiterated his plan that the United States would own the Gaza Strip. So not just that the Palestinians would be cleared out, but that the US would control it. He said it would be people from the Middle East living there, but the United States would control it. King Abdullah was asked in that press briefing what he made of that proposal.
King Abdullah, what do you think about the U.S. taking over the Gaza Strip? Do you want to see the U.S. own the Gaza Strip?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, the president is looking at Egypt coming to present their plan. As I said, we will be in Saudi Arabia to discuss how we can work with the president and with the United States. So I think let's wait until the Egyptians can come and present to the president and not get ahead of ourselves.
And is there a parcel of land in Jordan that you're willing to have Palestinians?
Well, I think what we said, I have to look at the best interests of my country. I think the president is very happy that we do this thing with 2,000 children as quickly as possible. And again, I believe that the president is looking forward to getting a group of us Arabs here to discuss the overall plan.
So as you could see there, King Abdullah seemed reluctant to directly contradict Donald Trump. That, of course, makes sense. The Americans provide 10% of his government's budget. But he very clearly is also not willing to go along with Trump's plan to carve out a chunk of his country to facilitate the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. And he kept repeating that everyone should wait for a proposal being put forward by Egypt and other Arab states. It also seems like in that meeting between him and Trump, he had some impact in terms of softening the American president's stance. The day before that meeting, Trump had threatened to withhold over $1 billion in aid if Jordan didn't comply with his plan for Gaza. But this is what he said in the meeting.
Would you still consider withholding aid to those countries if they don't accept your plans to accept?
Well, I don't want to say that because we've had such a good relationship and we're doing so well just in the short time that we've been talking. I mean, the king just made a statement. I didn't ask him to do that, about literally saving 2,000 young children from the Gaza Strip. We didn't know about that. You didn't know about that. Nobody did except for the king and his son. I assume you told your son, right? And I just thought it was great. No, I think we'll do something. I don't have to threaten with money. We contribute a lot of money to Jordan and to Egypt, by the way, a lot, to both. But I don't have to threaten that. I think we're above that. I do believe we're above that.
So, I mean, in terms of diplomacy, that's impressive from King Abdullah, right? Donald Trump, the day before, has said, we'll withdraw their £1 billion if they don't agree to relocate hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, of course, against international law. Then the king goes into that meeting, says, you know what, before we even start talking, I'm going to announce that we're going to allow 2,000 kids to come and get cancer treatment. And Donald Trump suddenly like, maybe we don't need to force them. Maybe we can get along. It is really strange, really, really sort of unusual in terms of diplomacy to have this quite, childlike figure in a way in there, who seems to be driven so much by his whims. King Abdullah's diplomacy continued after the meetings. This is what he tweeted. I reiterated Jordan's steadfast position against the displacement of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. This is the unified Arab position. Rebuilding Gaza without displacing the Palestinians and addressing the dire humanitarian situation should be the priority for all. Achieving just peace on the basis of the two-state solution is the way to ensure regional stability. This requires US leadership. President Trump is a man of peace. He was instrumental in securing the Gaza ceasefire. We look to the US and all stakeholders in ensuring it holds. This is obviously what all world leaders are kind of learning, is that the way you do diplomacy with Donald Trump is you stand firm, but you heap praise on him. You heap praise on him. But this still remains an open question. Can King Abdullah ultimately resist Trump's attempt to rope him in to his ethnic cleansing plan? Well, earlier today, I spoke to Anel Shalin of Washington's Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Anel has written a recent article on the website on the costs for Jordan were they to acquiesce to Trump's wishes. And she also has a very interesting perspective on the US approach to the war on Gaza more generally. That's because she worked for the State Department until March last year, when she resigned in protest at Biden's unconditional support for Israel. We discuss all of that, but I started by asking for Anel Shalin to give her thoughts on the latest threats to the Israel-Hamas ceasefire.
So unfortunately, it does seem like the ceasefire is about to break down. Israel is blaming Hamas for not releasing additional hostages. Hamas has made clear that Israel has repeatedly violated the ceasefire, and this is why they were putting a pause on releasing additional hostages until Israel complied with the conditions of the ceasefire, including allowing in this vitally important aid. There have been reports that Israel has allowed in some aid that is not actually what people need. I mean, people need food and tents and medical supplies. And so possibly this is an effort by Israel to say, well, look, we let in so-and-so number of trucks, but I mean, if it doesn't have life-saving aid on it, it's no good to people in Gaza. In addition to that, Israel has killed multiple people, Palestinians inside Gaza. I mean, it has not been at the same scale that we have seen prior to the ceasefire. But again, it has not, in fact, actually upheld the terms of a ceasefire, which are to end the violence, and the conditions of the ceasefire, which are to allow in the desperately needed aid. What's interesting is this has been acknowledged in the Israeli media that Israel is violating the terms of the ceasefire, but in U.S. media, you tend to just hear, Hamas is the one violating the ceasefire. Well, Trump himself indicated this in seeing the images of hostages, Israeli hostages that Hamas released that were clearly undernourished, appeared very gaunt and ill. And this seemed to cause him some consternation. This is somewhat maddening, both because the reason they're starving is because Israel is starving Gaza. So many people inside Gaza are gaunt and ill, and many have starved to death, but in particular young children who are so susceptible to insufficient nutrition. So it's just maddening from my perspective that Trump is clearly only looking at what happens when the Israeli hostages are released and not actually looking at what is happening inside of Gaza, or in addition, how Palestinian hostages look when they are released from Israeli jails and detention facilities, many of whom were simply picked up in a raid, and there are no charges against them. There's no legal justification for holding them. Many of them, the majority, are released appearing, again, extremely sick. Many have been subjected to torture. They've been starved. They also appear extremely gaunt, traumatized. But again, clearly Trump is only paying attention and only really viewing the humanity of Israelis released from Gaza.
It's infuriating what you've described there. I mean, it's also somewhat depressing. If you think that sort of the most likely outcome now is that the bombing does begin again on Saturday, because I suppose another interpretation of what we're seeing now is that this is sort of a play or a renegotiation strategy, or sort of Hamas trying to put pressure on Israel to keep to the agreement, and that perhaps it's in neither of their interests to begin sort of full-scale bombardment again. But you think that this is for real, that sort of it is very likely that the ceasefire will be over by Saturday?
Unfortunately, yes. I mean, Netanyahu didn't want to agree to the first phase of the ceasefire. And it was only the fact that Trump actually finally applied the massive leverage the United States has over Israel, which Biden was never willing to do. And when that ceasefire was announced, my initial concern was that Trump was really only interested in being able to boast about the fact that he achieved a ceasefire by his inauguration, and anything past that he really wasn't that interested in. Then subsequently we heard these comments about his plans. He wants the US to own Gaza. He's planning to develop Gaza. He plans to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza and not let them return. I mean, it's not as if Trump's plan for Gaza is anything good. But at least it seemed initially that perhaps he was committed to requiring Netanyahu to stick to the ceasefire. Now, and again, this is sort of just an indication of kind of, whatever was the last thing Trump saw or heard is now his policy moving forward. And so again, these images of gaunt Israeli prisoners being released, now suddenly he's no longer committed to the ceasefire. I mean, potentially this could derail his alleged plan to make Gaza the Riviera, another Riviera on the Mediterranean. But I mean, just in general, it just speaks to sort of the overall lack of understanding that Trump possesses of the situation, that he's only getting sort of very brief snapshots of what's going on and lacks the overall context. One of which, is so fundamental. When a journalist asked him after he met King Abdullah yesterday, he was saying that the Palestinians will want to leave Gaza because he's going to build them, beautiful homes somewhere else. And journalists said, well, many of them don't want to leave. Like, what are you going to do with the fact that this is the nature of the issue, that Israel has been trying to expel Palestinians since prior to 1948, but in particular since 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel. And Palestinians have been resisting that expulsion. And so this is just the latest instance of that expulsion. And Trump just wouldn't even countenance that. He just said, no, they'll want to leave.
And obviously one other barrier to Trump sort of achieving his plan of ethnically cleansing the Gaza Strip is that he's saying, oh, these people can go to Egypt, they can go to Jordan, they can go to elsewhere in the Middle East. And those countries, for a number of reasons, don't want to agree to such a plan. Obviously, that was sort of presumably what they were mainly discussing yesterday, Trump and King Abdullah. They spoke in private, didn't they, as well as speaking to the press. Could you explain, because I know you've written about this for the Quincy Institute, why for Jordan in particular, accepting sort of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians would be sort of deeply problematic and destabilizing for that nation?
Exactly. So this is an existential threat for Jordan. And when Jordan and Israel signed their peace treaty in 1994, one of the conditions was that Israel would no longer try to expel Palestinians into Jordan and would no longer consider Jordan the so-called alternate homeland, that previously this had been floated as a plan. Jordan is already approximately half Palestinian as a result of the expulsion of Palestinians following the creation of the State of Israel and subsequent wars. So at the time, in 1948, over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homeland. Many of them ended up in Jordan. This tripled Jordan's population at the time. So this fundamentally altered Jordan. Jordan was able to just sort of carry on at that point. It was still... it was the relationship with the UK. It was still sort of in a more of a protectorate status. But if King Abdullah were to now allow or fail to resist the expulsion of hundreds of thousands or 1 million Palestinians, he would very likely be overthrown. I mean, the level of opposition to the peace treaty itself remains extremely high in Jordan. The level of opposition to Israel's actions against Gaza since October 7th have resulted in massive boycotts of American and European goods in Jordan. I mean, Jordanians, for the most part, are not free to express their opposition other than sort of through the purse, although we have seen 3 separate attacks by Jordanians, 2 of which occurred on the Israeli border, one of which was against the Israeli embassy in Amman. So if we actually saw King Abdullah overthrown, it is very likely that whatever replaced the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan would not be willing to sign a peace treaty with Israel, would not be willing to host US troops. So again, from sort of both Israel's perspective and Trump's perspective, it is not in their own interest to force Abdullah to commit political suicide by accepting hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, because the result would be a state of Jordan that would either engage in open aggression against the state of Israel, or it might be something similar to Lebanon, where you'd have militants, Israel and forces in Israel and forces in Jordan exchanging rocket fire over the border in ways that obviously Israel has made clear it considers intolerable given its reaction to Hezbollah's rockets from Lebanon.
And I mean, what will Trump, or how far do you think Trump could go to try and, I think most sort of experts think this is a non-starter, right? Because obviously the premise that the Palestinians will willingly leave Gaza in their hundreds of thousands or millions is wrong. And then it doesn't seem like anyone in the region is willing to go along with this. But where do you think Donald Trump might see some weaknesses? I mean, can he sort of go to Jelani in Syria and say, you need to take these Palestinians? What leverage does he have over the Egyptians? I know 10% of the Jordanian sort of government budget is from the Americans. So what's he going to be trying to do now? He thinks he's a deal maker. He presumably thinks that there is sort of some point of weakness that he can push on to get someone in that region to sort of go along with this plan.
I mean, this really would be political suicide for any of the Arab rulers. For Jordan, it is truly existential, given that Jordan itself just doesn't have that large of a population. And so this would be, again, sort of fundamentally altering Jordan in a way that would be so destabilizing. For Egypt has a much larger population, but again, it would just be so politically unpopular. And I mean, Sisi is already facing the fact that there's widespread discontent in Egypt. The economic situation is dire. I mean, none of these are countries where the rulers have a lot of leeway. From Trump's perspective, I mean, what I would hope the deal he would try to make would be the deal that the Saudis have put on the table, which is that they are willing to normalize with Israel if there is a state of Palestine, and they've specified with Jerusalem as its capital. And so, if Trump fancies himself this deal maker, hopes to get a Nobel Peace Prize out of this, which he thinks he deserves, that has long been the solution on the table. I mean, this goes back to the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, that all of the Arab states would be willing to normalize and establish relations, close relations, trade relations with Israel, if Israel were to agree to establish a state of Palestine. We're not going to see that coming out of this current Israeli government. But if the United States were to say, we're not going to send you any more support, we're not going to send any more money or weapons until you move towards establishing a state of Palestine for real this time, not like during Oslo, where that was the stated goal, but actually the US and Israel were actively making sure that wasn't happening. This is the only way to actually finally resolve this conflict, because anything else, any expulsion of Palestinians into other territory is just going to result in the similar conditions that we observed after the creation of the State of Israel, where you had Egypt going to war, you had Jordan going to war, you had Syria going to war against Israel as a result of the expulsion of Palestinians, and then in addition having to deal with insurgent groups in those territories as well.
And you've said that's what the United States would have to do if it genuinely wanted peace. Now, I know you've got experience in the State Department. You resigned from your role there in protest at the Biden administration and their role in Israel's genocidal war on Gaza. We're now looking at a Donald Trump presidency who sort of, at least in terms of what he says, seems even more sort of further to the right, more dismissive of the human rights of Palestinians, in the sense that he's sort of willing to actively stand up and say, let's just ethnically cleanse all 2 million of them. You're suggesting there that this would be the option. I suppose you could say the upside of Trump is he's so unpredictable that he can go from openly backing genocide to the next day or the next month deciding, actually, no, the Palestinians need a state. I mean, Do you see some sort of opportunity in Donald Trump's unpredictability, I suppose?
I mean, to clarify one point, the plan of ethnically displacing Palestinians from Gaza was floated by Biden and in Congress early on, soon, not long after October 7th. And again, Egypt and Jordan shut it down. And, Biden wasn't willing to necessarily push on those two U.S. partners in the same way that Trump is clearly more willing to do so. I think in terms of, is there an opportunity here with Trump? I think there's more of an opportunity than there was with Biden, who was a self-proclaimed committed Zionist. I mean, this was his ideology. Whereas Trump, I think, is just trying to look out for his own interests. Unfortunately, we do know that much of his team are also committed Zionists. I mean, people like Mike Huckabee, the committed evangelist, for whom this is a religious obligation to have the state of Israel. Again, I find it sort of, as someone who studied the Middle East and for such a long time has had to deal with this notion that, well, it's their religious fundamentalism. It's these, Muslims and the association with terrorism, like the extent to which the commentariat has been willing to buy into this Islamophobic nonsense, but also accepts this notion that sort of Israel has this like biblical right to be, that like it's just so maddening that one side is castigated for their religion, and that is seen as such a source of problems. And yet we also accept the sort of evangelical Zionist, the notion that because the Bible says it, that's why we need to have the Jews in the so-called land of Israel. So, I mean, in general, I hope that Trump might see it ultimately as being more in his own interest to achieve this broader deal and push Israel to establish a state of Palestine. But I'm not optimistic at all about that, just given the vast amounts of money given to him by powerful donors like Miriam Adelson, who very much want Israel to annex the entire West Bank, other very powerful, wealthy forces inside the Israel lobby in the United States. Again, unfortunately, in the aftermath of Citizens United, where we saw so much money influencing American politics than was previously permitted to do, we've seen this disconnect between the American Jewish community, which historically, grassroots support for the state of Israel came from the historically progressive American Jewish community. Whereas now we've started to see a split where you have these billionaire donors who remain committed to this expansionist view of a greater Israel. And yet many members of the American Jewish community themselves are no longer comfortable with what Israel has been doing, the genocide Israel is committing. But because the Israel lobby is no longer beholden to sort of a grassroots, the actual organic community of American Jewish people, instead they're committed to this sort of billionaire donor agenda who do want this expansionary Israel, who cheer that Israel has expanded into southern Lebanon, has taken parts of Syria, is likely about to annex the West Bank, is trying to take Gaza. It is leading to greater and greater instability and violence. And Trump campaigned on being the so-called peacemaker. And yet at the same time, he's talking about, not naming it specifically, but in terms of taking Gaza, how would that happen except with U.S. troops?
And in terms of sort of another difference between Biden and Trump, so you said there that sort of, the Biden administration was perfectly comfortable with the idea of clearing out 2 million people from Gaza, but it was shut down by Jordan and Egypt when their government said, we don't want to go along with this. In your article in the Quincy Institute, or for the Quincy Institute, you sort of say one sort of difference with Trump, potentially compared to previous presidents, is he doesn't really understand that the quid pro quo between America and these sort of Middle Eastern, often dictatorships, is sort of that the Americans recognize that they have to prop up these dictatorships if they allow them to sort of have military bases there, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas Trump seems willing to pressure these leaders, these governments, to take actions that could cause their own downfall. And that this could be, I suppose, throwing up in the air the deal which is behind sort of American hegemony in the region, at least with certain states. Do you think the way that Trump is behaving could potentially sort of make that whole system collapse, and that potentially countries like Jordan or Egypt who want a guarantee of stability instead of looking to the United States will look to China, for example?
Absolutely. So after Israel, Egypt receives the next most foreign assistance from the United States. And after that, it's Jordan. And then obviously subsequent countries, Iraq received Ukraine right now, Afghanistan. But those three countries, Israel, Egypt, and Jordan, have long been the largest recipients of U.S. assistance because Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1979. Jordan signed their peace treaty in 1994. And the U.S. has essentially been bribing them since then to maintain those peace treaties. And those governments have increasingly become dependent on this support from the United States, much of which does take the form of weapons and military machinery in ways that sort of serve the interests of the U.S. military-industrial complex. But the point is, these are governments who've undertaken deeply unpopular moves. Similarly, other countries around the region, the UAE, for example, normalizing relations with Israel. I mean, that's not popular. Morocco agreeing to normalize relations with Israel. There have been massive protests in Morocco in the aftermath of October 7th as a result of that normalization agreement. So from Israel and from the United States perspective, they prefer having autocratic governments in the Middle East that are willing to go along with the US and Israeli vision for the region, as long as the US continues to send this military support and props up these governments. They're going to go along with it. But that all changes if the US and if Trump forces one of these leaders to commit political suicide, in Jordan's case, by accepting some vast number of Palestinians, which would likely lead to his overthrow. And so that does shift the calculus. As you said, the countries around the region who up to this point have had to sort of go along with, there weren't many other options, especially in the aftermath of the Cold War. The United States was really the only game in town. Whereas now there are alternatives. We've seen, obviously, the Syrian government having aligned relatively closely with Putin's Russia. We have already China playing an extremely important economic role in the region, not playing the same sort of security role as the United States. And again, China would not be likely to replace the United States as a security guarantor because China's not interested in playing that kind of a role. But increasingly, you could have governments in the region whose calculus changes, who say, I was willing to go along with this as long as the United States helped keep me in power. But if the US is trying to have me undertake a decision that causes me to lose power, then why would I continue to agree to these, to a peace treaty with Israel or to, other things that the United States wants?
In a different part of the world, or in reference to a different part of the world, there was a bit of breaking news before we came on air. Again, about Donald Trump, but about another war. The US president posted this on Truth Social this afternoon. So it's long, my apologies. I just had a lengthy and highly productive call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. We discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, artificial intelligence, the power of the dollar. And this sounds like a Lex Friedman podcast. And the power of the dollar and various other subjects. We both, or downstream, I should say. He goes, we both reflected on the great history of our nations and the fact that we fought so successfully together in World War II, remembering that Russia lost tens of millions of people and we likewise lost so many! ! We each talked about the strengths of our respective nations and the great benefit that we will someday have in working together. But first, as we both agreed, we want to stop the millions of deaths taking place in the war with Russia-Ukraine. President Putin even used my very strong campaign motto of common sense. We both believe very strongly in it. We agreed to work together very closely, including visiting each other's nations. We have also agreed to have our respective teams start negotiations immediately. And we will begin by calling President Zelensky of Ukraine to inform him of the conversation, something which I will be doing right now. I have asked Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Director of the CIA, John Ratcliffe, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Ambassador and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to lead the negotiations, which I feel strongly will be successful. Millions of people have died in a war that would not have happened if I were president, but it did happen, so it must end. No more lives should be lost! ! I want to thank President Putin for his time and effort with respect to this call and for the release yesterday of Mark Fogel, a wonderful man that I personally greeted last night at the White House. I believe this effort will lead to a successful conclusion, hopefully soon. It's not clear what Ukraine will make of these bilateral negotiations that seemed designed to leave them out. But it comes on the back of new US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth making this demand of NATO allies earlier today.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
Hegseth also said it was, quote, unrealistic for Ukraine's borders to return to their 2014 position. That was before, of course, Russia's annexation of Crimea. Helena, welcome to the show. Great to have you on. Thanks for your patience while we spoke to that brave former State Department official. What do you make of this announcement? I mean, obviously for Ukrainians, going to be somewhat concerning. I mean, at the same time, it seems sensible to not have troops in Ukraine covered by Article 5 of the NATO treaty, because that would move the West very close to sort of an all-out direct conflict with Russia. What do you make of this?
Well, I think this was clearly in the making. I think this was something that was likely to be happening once we had Trump in the White House. I mean, it's clear that there are already kind of some levels of diplomatic links between the interests of the White House under Trump and the interests of Vladimir Putin in trying to come to some kind of agreement here, especially since, you know, if there's going to be a negotiator who's going to be happy to have Ukrainian territory seized or potential kind of compromising of the original boundaries of kind of the European kind of vanguard against Russian aggression, it would be a Trump administration rather than a Democratic administration. And we would expect that some kind of territorial change would be part of any kind of a negotiated settlement to the end of the conflict. And this is clearly what Putin wants, right? He also is getting the acquiescence towards no ascension to NATO. There probably won't be an ascension to the European Union either for Ukraine after all of this. Therefore, that is some of Putin's security guarantees in terms of Ukraine's role in Europe confirmed by what is, as far as I'm concerned, is likely to come out of this negotiated settlement. And it's on his terms, as he's the first person of call and first port of call that Trump has gone to with regards to this. And as far as Trump is concerned, he gets exactly what he wants. No more American money gets poured into the forever conflict. He gets to at least move slightly closer to his stated aim of being quote unquote America first, apart from Israel, of course. There's always the exception, right? But one thing that really kind of dogged the Republicans in the run up to the general election in 2024 was the fact that a lot of Republicans really did not like how much money was being pumped into Ukraine, even though a lot of this was just excess military technology anyway, that had already had money spent on it regardless. And it was in no way similar to the level of support they'd given to Israel, which was not just in terms of military hardware, but in financial terms as well. Seemed to a misfire there in terms of the scale of frustration with money being spent not on American citizens. But regardless, Trump can go to his people, to his base, and say, look, I am the one who is ensuring that this conflict ends and America plays no part in being the world police anymore and spending your taxpayers' money as far as they are concerned in the electorate on the Ukrainian conflict. As far as Ukraine is concerned, the people there, now, I agree, it will definitely be very concerning for them that these negotiations are happening without them and they are essentially the third party getting an input into the discussion after lots of these terms have been hashed out, or at least the start of the terms have been hashed out by Putin and Trump already. But I was looking at the polling, like the one kind of point of inflection is, when are Ukraine going to want to stop fighting? And for a very, very, very long time, despite how many losses the Ukrainians were taking, up until late 2024, there was still a plurality, and indeed in most of 2024, a majority of Ukrainians who felt that the what they should be doing was continuing to fight. This trend remained a plurality up until around about August 2024. And since then, there has now been a plurality for ending the conflict and a plurality potentially for ceding territory as well. I think in the last polling, which is in November 2024, it was 52% of Ukrainians, so an actual majority now, think that any peace deal would be happy, or they would at least be okay with territorial exchanges in the ceasefire terms. And that's a majority. That shouldn't be sniffed at. And the same is true in terms of polling for wanting a ceasefire to end the conflict rather than continue fighting. And that was at 58% in November 2024. So even if they're not included in the initial talks, as we've seen in that announcement from Trump on Truth Social, at the very least, there is now Ukrainian acquiescence to a negotiated settlement that there wasn't before the election. It should be interesting to see where this goes from here.
I mean, in a way, there might be a sense in which it's helpful for Zelensky for him not to be in the negotiating room, because then then whatever's agreed, he can sort of say, well, it was a fait accompli. You know, we weren't going to fight this without the Americans. Whereas if he's in the room, then anything that comes out of the agreement sort of has his name on it, and sort of opposition within Ukraine can say we were sold out by Zelensky. Whereas if the deal is signed between Putin and Trump, and anyone says, well, why did you acquiesce? What were you going to do? Like, we know we can't fight this war without the Americans, and they've come up with this deal. I mean, I suppose where I stand on this, my sort of initial reaction to this news, which is sort of somewhat undeveloped because it only broke sort of half an hour before we started. The idea that Ukraine is going to have to cede some territory, and clearly there won't be a security sort of guarantee for Ukraine or whatever is left of Ukraine. To me, that was always going to be the outcome of whatever negotiations happen. I mean, I think the question is too much being conceded before the negotiations have even begun, right? You know, Trump, we think of him as this negotiator. He seems to be sort of giving Putin quite a lot of what he wants before even getting into the room. And I suppose if you're a Ukrainian, even if you're a Ukrainian who's sort of accepted that you're going to have to cede some territory, and there's not going to be a NATO guarantee, like maybe it'll be a security guarantee from the Europeans or something like that. If all of this has been conceded before they've even got in the room, you will be a bit worried about what's going to happen next, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's the problem. I think with the reference that you made to the idea of, well, Zelensky not being in the room is preferable for his government, in which case they can blame all of it on the Americans. Like, these are the power that we're essentially subservient to here. We have no agency of our own in this. We fight when we can fight whilst the aid is there. And then as soon as the aid dries up and the people who were at the negotiating table decide without us, well, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. It's like when the government in the UK says, well, we've got Krango to do all of this policy for us, and they come up with something bad, so you can't really blame us. I think I agree with you on that one, but at the end of the day, since that there is so much Ukrainian acceptance that some territorial exchanges is going to have to happen, I mean, they'll probably be angry with Trump that so much has been given up so quickly, because the art of the deal really is it's definitely some presidential myth-making, really, rather than anything that's necessarily true in reality. Seems to be very Liz Truss in terms of what he's willing to do in terms to get a deal. But we shall see. I think most Ukrainians will be glad when their families stop dying.
After cheerleading the destruction of Gaza, the Telegraph is outraged. Some of its residents might want to come here. Their front page today complains that a court has given Gazans the right to settle in the UK, or one family of Gazans. Admittedly, in this instance, the means by which this Palestinian family were granted the right to settle in the UK is slightly surprising. The family of 6 fleeing Gaza applied to a resettlement scheme meant for Ukrainians fleeing their invasion by Russia. The Home Office deemed them inapplicable to what's called the Ukraine Family Scheme. And a lower-tier tribunal agreed, but an upper-tier immigration tribunal found that to deny them access to the Ukraine scheme would be to deny them their right to a family life. The scheme allowed Ukrainians to come here if they had a family member already settled in the UK, as this Palestinian family did. So they have a family member who I think has been in the UK since 2007 and is now a UK citizen. And the judge ruled that they should be granted asylum because of their right to family life, I think, according to the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, as you can imagine, this has become a bit of a political football, and Kemi Badenoch brought it up at today's PMQs.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government established the Ukraine Family Scheme, and in total, over 200,000 Ukrainians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, have found sanctuary in the UK from Putin's war. However, A family of 6 from Gaza have applied to live in Britain using this scheme, and a judge has now ruled in their favor. This is not what the scheme was designed to do. This decision is completely wrong. It cannot be allowed to stand. Is the government planning to appeal on any points of law? And if so, which ones?
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I do not agree with the decision. She's right. It's the wrong decision. She hasn't quite done her homework because the decision in question was taken under the last government, according to the legal framework of the last government. But, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. It should be Parliament that makes the rules on immigration. It should be the government that makes the policy. That is the principle, and the Home Secretary is already looking at the legal loophole which we need to close in this particular case.
So you can say here, I mean, Keir Starmer was saying it should be Parliament that makes the rules, not judges. Parliament obviously did make this rule sort of with regard to Ukraine, and now a judge is saying it can also apply to Gaza. Now I can see how sort of politically that's, I can see why he's saying he wants to close that loophole. I mean, the obvious thing here that makes me very angry is the fact that no one there has mentioned the fact that this family of 6 had their home destroyed by Israel. Oh, and actually it's not a surprise why they didn't mention it, right? Because it was, UK was part of the group of countries that helped supply those bombs. Kemi Badenoch went on to say this.
The issue we are discussing today is about judicial decisions. We cannot be in a situation where we allow enormous numbers of people to exploit our laws in this way. There are millions of people all around the world in terrible situations. We cannot help them all, and we certainly cannot bring them all here.
Okay, so we cannot help them all. We cannot bring them all here. All the people in the world who are sort of in a war-torn zone. Fine, it's probably true, right? But what we could do is stop selling the bombs that are destroying their homes, right? You can't say, we've done our best. We can't bear the whole of the world on our shoulders. Fine, you don't need to bear the whole world on your shoulders. Just stop selling the bombs that are being used to destroy people's homes, right? Stand up firmly against a government, the Israeli government, which is trying to ethnically cleanse a people, right? The Israeli government that the UK is very unwilling to withdraw its support from actively wants to push 2 million people out of their homes, right? That could destabilize Egypt, that could destabilize Jordan. And then we're like, what can we do? So we can't solve all of the world's problems. Stop creating the world's problems. Helena, what do you make of this particular story and this row that broke out in the House of Commons today?
Well, it just shows you that there are some things in UK politics that are agreed upon, that are the accepted ideology across the major political parties, that is political consensus. The first thing is that white is right, and that when you're going to be accepting refugees from other countries, again, fleeing almost identical circumstances, if a foreign country invades, tries to ethnically cleanse you, throw you out of your homes, completely destabilize you in the goal of seizing territory, right? Very, very similar circumstance in the ways in which these people have turfed out of their homes. And indeed, in most cases in Gaza, sometimes worse, is while Russia wants to at least use the homes that they take, that they seize, right? The territory they seize, they want to at least use the homes to settle Russians in. Israel wants to flatten everything to the ground to try and force these people out of their homes. And in these terms, right, only Ukrainians are okay. Only Ukrainians are okay to be let in identical terms for the reasons why they are fleeing this conflict. Like, do you think, like people say, well, Ukrainians will just return back to Ukraine? What do you think Ukrainians who fled from Donetsk and Luhansk are going to be able to come back to Ukraine once inevitably that territory gets ceded to Russia? Of course not. That's ridiculous. These are going to be people who are going to be long-time refugees in the UK. And people just accept this. Whereas when it comes to Palestinians who actually genuinely want to return to their homeland, who genuinely want to go back and live in Palestine, to be able to go back to the homes, the territory that Israel has been coveting ever since the Nakba in 1948. The fact that this comparison it's absolutely fine for Ukrainians, but terrible for Gazans and for Palestinians, just shows you that racism is kind of embedded in the way in which we do political discourse and political ideology for the mainstream parties in this country. And the second thing that is agreed upon between all of our major established political class is that if you're geopolitically allied with the West, the victims of your military incursions, they're none of our concern. They're none of our concern, right? Even if we, as you say, even if we sell them the weapons that they use to do it, we give them the diplomatic cover, which we've done since 1948 to do the crimes that they have committed against Palestinians, we will turn a blind eye. We will, as we've seen from what was broken by the National the other day, that we will have our Foreign Office engage in slight editing of information about the war crimes committed by Israel that's been provided to the Foreign Office so that we don't have to stop those weapon sales in the first place. Yet when it comes to our geopolitical enemies, such as Russia, doing very similar things to Ukrainians in the Eastern Territories and in the Donbass, we'll immediately criticize it. We'll open our doors wide open, as long as it can be used politically against our geopolitical enemies. Do you see the same with Hong Kong as well? We're very happy to have a refugee scheme for Hong Kong because China are our geopolitical enemies. When it comes to Palestinians, Israel will be able to get away with it. They'll be able to get away with it, and we will not treat the refugees that are the consequences of our very scant criticism of our allies' genocidal actions in that territory means that we will not treat Palestinians with the same level of welcome that we treat people who come from Hong Kong and Ukraine. So it's partially a race issue, but it's also partially a geopolitical strategy issue. And again, as you say, not wanting to hold our hands up and admit, well, maybe some of this is actually our fault to begin with, right? Because we didn't even admit to stuff like Afghanistan. We didn't even like to admit that some of that was our fault, given that Margaret Thatcher was inviting Gulbuddin Hekmatyar to number 10 in the 1980s when we were selling people weapons that then ended up in the hands of the Taliban when most of Hezb Islami became the Taliban, who would then cause the refugee crisis that we see right now from Afghanistan as well. We don't like to admit that any of this is our fault, because as long as it's only Russia or China's fault, sure, we'll be able to take you in. Otherwise, no thanks.
There were some pretty bizarre scenes in the White House last night when US tech bro-in-chief Elon Musk briefed the press from the office of the country's commander-in-chief, Donald Trump. This was one of the weirder moments.
Mr. Musk, you said on X that an example of the fraud that you have cited was $50 million of condoms was sent to Gaza. But after fact-check this, it apparently Gaza in Mozambique, and the program was to protect them against HIV. So can you correct the statements? It wasn't sent to Hamas, actually. It was sent to Mozambique, which makes sense why condoms was sent there. Yeah. And how can we make sure that all the statements that you said were correct, so we can trust what you say?
Well, first of all, some of the things that I say will be incorrect and should be corrected. So nobody's going to bat 1,000. I mean, we will make mistakes, but we'll act quickly to correct any mistakes.
He doesn't correct mistakes. If you go through his X account, right, it is just full of completely made up stuff by anonymous accounts, like anonymous accounts who are quite racist, just shares any old misinformation and never corrects it. By the way, the person sitting on his shoulders there was his son named X, whose mother is the musician Grimes. She was on Twitter saying her son shouldn't be out in public like that. She wants them to have private lives. Musk, likes to use them as props, I suppose. Helena, what did you make of that moment in the White House there?
I mean, yeah, you're right. And he is somebody who is basically his entire platform is made out of untruths. The fact that he will get community noted on his own website, or he'll take away the blue ticks of people who contradict him, or just completely ban them entirely, shows he's somebody who is incredibly thin-skinned. So for him to be sitting in the position that he's in and go, well, some things I say are going to be untrue and they should be corrected, when it's clear that he really, really hates being ever contradicted, so much so that it will bite through the incredibly thin skin of his. And this is a long list of the things that we've had from him since he took over Twitter that have made him, that's revealed to him his entirely thin skin, such as the moment where he had essentially was forced to admit that he'd been paying pro gamers to play his gaming accounts for him so that he could pretend that he was somebody who was the best in the world at like Diablo 4 or something. Like, this shows that a man who's incredibly thin skinned, who wants everybody to believe that he's somehow the God King that the tech bros believe that they are, when in reality he's just a spoiled little child who wants his own way all the time. And what's frustrating to me is that the ways in which people get into Trump's circle, we saw this, as you say, in the kind of skillful negotiations by the King of Jordan with Donald Trump, is that you can kind of get what you want as long as you humor Donald Trump, as long as you give him the ego boost that he needs. Elon Musk has gotten so much money into the Trump campaign, he's basically skipped that step financially. But I genuinely believe that people want to break this relationship up. And we all know that there's been plenty of reports that the Trump campaign find Elon Musk really irritating. because he is, that you'd probably be able to break the link between the two of them. Just keep on referring to him as President Musk. Because we all know that he is, right? He is the shadow president at this point, in the same way that we have plenty of shadow prime ministers in the ranks of the political class at the moment in the UK. And do you think Donald Trump, who also has very thin skin, would accept people referring to him not as the president, but as the deputy president to President Musk? Well, of course not. And you'd be able to, you'd be able to pull at the strings of Trump's ego by undermining it, and that he is somehow in the thrall of Musk as the leader of the United States, as opposed to him being his little bitch boy.
The scandal around a Labour right WhatsApp group just keeps on growing. The so-called Trigger Me Timbers group, so-called, that's what they called it, consisted of around 50 members. I didn't realise it was 50. Many of them councillors and party officials. Crazy to put all of this in a group with 50 members. Their fondness for sexist, racist and downright offensive comments about other party members and constituents has seen quite a few heads roll. So Health Minister Andrew Gwynn has been sacked over his comments in the group. Burnley's Labour MP, Oliver Ryan, has also been suspended over his Trigger Me Timbers messages. And now a further 11 Labour councillors have been suspended from the party for their participation in the group. Can you imagine if your whole council group had to resign because they were in some stupid WhatsApp group? Some of the comments the group's members made are pretty grim. So left-wing party members are called trots over 190 times. Andrew Gwynn hoped one of his constituents would, quote, croak. That was because he complained about bin collections. And he referred to another as, quote, an illiterate retard. The group also targeted Richard Bergen, Rebecca Long-Bailey, Diane Abbott and Angela Rayner with some pretty malicious comments. But in the 1,000-page long transcript of their group chats obtained by Novara Media, there was one exchange that particularly jumped out. So in 2021, Novara Media's co-founder, Aaron Bastani, left the Labour Party, criticising divisions driven by the party's right. Here's how now suspended MP Oliver Ryan, disgraced former Minister Andrew Gwynn, and a third member of the group responded to that news. So Andrew Gwynn shares the tweet from Lee Harpin, sort of explaining this news. And then he says, Bastardi has quit, which is a very clever play on Aaron Bastani's name because he's made it into Bastardi, like he's a bastard. And then Oliver Ryan says, I saw with some champagne glasses, oh, happy days, just Bergen and Pidcock now. And then Andrew Gwynn, who's very good at changing names to make them offensive, says Norovirus Media will be disaffiliating. Oliver Ryan says, hope so, SWP. And then the unnamed person, did you read his quotes? My God, what's his PhD made of? Sellotape. Norovirus Media. Lots of people do call us that on the right. I find it juvenile, let's say. You're allowed to hate our organisation, but grow up. Of course, Novara Media is still growing strong, and we can't say the same for Oliver Ryan and Andrew Gwynn, who are suspended from the party, and I think look pretty silly in public. Helena, I've had mixed feelings. Well, I haven't had mixed feelings about this story at all. I'm just going to tell you my feelings about this story, which aren't really mixed. I'm very confident in them. Which is, I feel like lots of people think if their group chats were to be downloaded and put in public, it would be, you could take things out of context. It would be embarrassing. It's not very nice. I also think that we shouldn't be too quick to sort of expel people from public life for having said mean things in a context which they thought was private. Obviously, it's stupid to be saying this in a group of so many people. But the same thing stood out to me from this as did from like the Labour leaks, which is these people are very juvenile, right? Like if all of my WhatsApp messages were to get downloaded, there would be some things that I would be probably embarrassed about, or that sort of like I'd feel a bit mean about, or that, I was being a bit edgier than I would be in public, let's say. But like Aaron Bastardi, Norovirus Media, it's like I'm just not that kind of pathetic and kind of, yeah, it's just a bit sad. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, clearly they describe us as Norovirus Media because our current affairs coverage is infectious. That is why that they have described us as such, because clearly people cannot stop catching the things that we're giving out to the public, But either way, I think I do agree with you that, I am not past being juvenile. Anyone who follows my Twitter account will know that. I'm absolutely in no way do I think that being juvenile is below me. But if I'm a YouTuber, I'm not an elected representative, right? The bar should be higher. But I do think you're right that in some cases, anything like the statements that are being made that they're really being vilified for. I've worked in retail. I've called customers worse things behind their back. Like, at the end of the day, some of the things that are being touted as being evidence that some of these people in these group chats can never be public servants. This is something that's unbecoming of them. I'm just like, well, this is all private stuff they thought would remain private rather than things they would say out in the open. But some of the things that aren't being treated with the level of seriousness that they should be is the stuff that is anti-Semitic. Right? So there was the comments about somebody sounding too Jewish, and from Andrew Gwynedd saying that asking, is he from Mossad? Like, that is some anti-Semitism as far as I'm concerned. And this was not covered, given the same amount of levels of scrutiny from these Labour right figures, these anti-left figures, which you can see from the ways with which they treat not only people who are on the left outside of Labour, but also internally as well. Not even that far left, like Angela Rayner coming under the level of vitriol from these people when she's very much on the soft left shows you just how factional these people are. But the fact that these people don't get the coverage for things like, I think Oliver Ryan was caught with some statements in the WhatsApp group that could be deemed anti-Semitic. At the end of the day, does the fish still rot from the head? Does Keir Starmer still know what he must do if he's got this culture of anti-Semitism within the party? Will he say that the scale of anti-Semitism is being over-exaggerated for political reasons? Will this be this whole media scandal story? Or will the press quietly leave it alone? Because actually a lot of the reasons why the press caught on to the Labour anti-Semitism scandal at the time was because of the geopolitical relationship towards Israel's occupation of Palestine amongst the Labour left. Like, it seems to me that the coverage of these things is being treated differently depending on whether things seem to be unbecoming because they're juvenile, or whether we actually scrutinise the pretty kind of gruesome racist comments that you're seeing, again, about Diane Abbott too, as well as these anti-Semitic comments that you've seen in these WhatsApp leaks as well. One last thing I would say is that so much for high quality candidates. Would you imagine you'd see these kind of statements being made by the people who've been blocked from standing to be Labour candidates at the last election? Do you think you'd be hearing this from a Lauren Townsend or a Lee Drennan or a Sean Halsall or anybody like that? I don't think you would. Yet the kind of people who are in with their faction, they're the people who got promoted in these instances. Again, people who've said these things that once they've been open to the public haven't been very happy with. Maybe there's some manufactured consent being led on there, but I don't think many people are going to be happy to hear that their elected representative thought they might die or hoped they would die, even in a joking fashion, by the next local election. So the coverage of this is kind of the thing I take issue with, rather than a lot of the statements that have actually been brought to light by the leaking of this WhatsApp group.
Yeah, I have to admit, I basically just haven't read much about this story, because when something is about like WhatsApp, I tend to just think like I should read something more significant than this. But was the tweets that sound anti-Semitic, when I sort of saw that, just sort of like on someone mentioning it on Twitter, I was like, were they maybe just saying that as sort of kind of taking the piss out of people they deem to be anti-Semitic? So maybe he's in Mossad. I thought maybe they were sort of like trying to take the piss out of the Labour left, who they think of. But I haven't read them in context, and it sounds like you have. So are they sort of genuinely offensive and it should be taken seriously? Not that they were sort of trying to be edgy and trying to take the piss out of people they think are anti-Semitic. I don't know. I'm expressing my ignorance here. So what should I know?
I mean, to be clear, I haven't read these things specifically in context either, right? But at the very least, there should be a broader discussion in the media about what these things represent, right? I've only seen the leaks that have been proportioned in the articles that I've read on this specific issue. And whilst there's been a footnote, this has been ancillary to the main point they've made about the statements about the bin collection bit, which was the thing that I thought was, not nice, but kind of frivolous in the large scale stuff. But there's been like, could the anti-Semitism crisis reevaluate? But I'm like, well, how about we actually scrutinize this? And it's not seen the same level of scrutiny as far as I'm concerned. If someone's to enlighten me on the true context, if you have access to the full leaks that we'll be able to view, then I would like to see that. I personally haven't, so I wouldn't make those comments. But at the very least, are we really going to see the same level of coverage over even the potential for this, because a lot of the statements that were made that were deemed anti-Semitic from people on the Labour left during the crisis at the time were things that were either stuff that was historically accurate but wasn't particularly politically sensitive, or was indeed a joke. Like, remember the Joe Bird incident, where she is Jewish herself, and she said something about Jew protest as like a play on words, about, again, parodying the attitude that people had over the supposed crisis of anti-Semitism, and then was treated as, made her a persona non grata, when it was a joke, a self-deprecating joke about her own ethnicity, rather than like a genuine claim, right? And that received loads of scrutiny, and nobody bore the reason for why those statements were made. And yet she was seen as being so far gone that she should not be allowed in the Labour Party at all, and was expelled on grounds of the fact that she spoke at a prescribed group's event like 3 years before they were even prescribed, right? It was a retroactive expulsion from the party, when, again, this was completely outside of the kind of proper due process that people should be having within the Labour Party. And again, she didn't get any charitability at all.
Yeah, no, I agree on the double standards. Obviously, no, if this was a group of Labour lefties or anyone who sort of ever said anything about Palestine in their life, no one would be being charitable about the statements that they made. Let's wrap up there. Helena, it's been a pleasure, as always, being joined by you this evening. Thank you so much for joining me on Novara Live.
Absolute pleasure as well. Good to see you, Michael.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. You can see we've got this at the bottom there. Support us at Novara Media. I don't know what it says, actually, because I've got something in the way of it. Support Norovirus Media. Is that what it says? Support Norovirus Media. Because we're, as Helena says, we're infectious. But if you want to do some gain of function, or if you want to fund some gain of function research on our organisation, go to novaramedia.com/support. Donate whatever you can afford. We really do appreciate it. If you already are a supporter, thank you so much. And thank you all for watching. And we'll be back tomorrow. For now, you've been watching Novara Live. Good night.